Hey there, this is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. Welcome to the Exit Readiness podcast. I'm here with co-host Walter Dial, who is tax partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors here in Bethesda, Maryland. And my business partner, Corby McGordon, is here with us today as well. Our mission here on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building sellable or transferable business value, and then planning your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's transferable and then exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. In the work that we do, when we're not doing podcast episodes, we're agnostic as to how an owner exits. We want to help the owner clarify and then establish their goals for exit, financial goals, values-based goals, even legacy goals, and then identify the best exit route that's going to attain those goals and help them design a plan to make it happen. And the potential exit routes, most common for small businesses that we're working with, would be a sale to a third party, and that would be either a strategic or a financial buyer. If they have children in the business or family members, an exit route might be transferring or selling or gifting the business to the children or the family in the business. A sale to an ESOP is another potential exit route. Liquidation, but that's typically not a chosen exit route, but more of a default if there was no plan in place in the first place. Absentee ownership, maybe their exit plan is to more and more pull back from the business while the business continues, and they transfer to death. And then what we're going to talk about today, and really we're going to have a short series of episodes on this exit route I'm going to mention now, and that's sale to insiders. Which might be insiders, might be key employees, a key employee group, or KEG, as we refer to a key employee group, and or co-owners. And some of the reasons an owner might lean in this direction of an insider sale would include the deal could be structured to align with your timing, the time period that you want to leave, your goals. You'd have time, typically 5 to 10 years, to develop and pursue interest outside of the business and create that plan for life after the business, which is so essential for a happy exit. You could control the deal structure and emphasize tax minimization, if that's a core value, which is often the case. The culture you've worked so hard to build, maybe for decades, is more than likely going to be maintained with a sale to insiders than it would be with a third-party sale or a third-party sale, really. And maybe too, another reason might be you want to reward employees who have helped you build a business by with them retaining their jobs and having a future with the business that they've worked with and helped to build for years. And maybe your successors who you've identified share your values and the vision for the company. They've been trained on the job and they're motivated to stay and grow the company. That's not an exhaustive list of reasons, but it's a good representative list. There's some key reasons on there that someone might choose this exit route of selling to insiders. However, there are many things to consider before choosing this direction, because there are risks to mitigate. Most prominent being the risk of the owner not receiving all the money that they either need or want out of the business. So before we even recommend this exit route, again, we're agnostic as to which route. We just want to figure out which is going to be the best one. Even before we recommend the route to an owner, there are a number of things to consider and analyze prior to us doing that. And that's what we're going to discuss today, and probably in the next episode as well. What do I think about? What do I need to think about before choosing a sale to insiders? Okay, well, one thing is assumptions, testing owner assumptions. All owners that we've met have made some assumption or assumptions on some level regarding their eventual exit. And this is certainly the case when it comes to selling to insiders. And so, guys, Walter, Corb, what are common assumptions that we bump into when we first start a dialogue with an owner about a sale to insiders?
Well, I don't think we bump into this one a lot, hopefully. I have seen it on occasion. And that's the one where the individual hasn't planned for their exit ahead of time. They've just kind of either gotten tired of working, or they wake up one day and realize they're 65 years old. And their assumption is, well, I haven't done anything to make my business attractive to an outside competitor or customer or buyer. So I'm just going to transfer it to insiders. That's a horrible assumption. And you have to be aware that anything you would do to get your business ready to look good for an outside buyer is probably even more important on the inside when you do a transfer to insiders, because as we're going to, another assumption is that the insiders don't have the money to pay you, which means you're taking back a note. That note is going to get paid off based on the success of the business. So it's that much more critical that you're handing off a business that has transferable value and that has got all the things that go into that: systems in place, a management team, diversity of roles, diversity of customers, diversity of suppliers. So don't make the assumption that, my business isn't that great, so I'll go ahead and just transfer it to my key people. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, don't make the assumption, and with a correlating assumption that you're going to get all the money out of the business that you want to get out of it by doing that, because it's a good chance you're not going to. Corby, you're laughing over there. Do you have some thought? Clearly.
Oh,
yeah.
And I'm thinking, even, we talk about building value, and even at times, if an owner's done a good job of building management, there can be an assumption then that managers, one, want to be owners, and two, are able to be owners. Because managing a company is very different than owning it. And I think oftentimes business owners underestimate their own skill in being executives. They do so much that they don't even think about. It's second nature, but they've got fire in the belly. They think holistically about keeping everything afloat. And that's just a really different skill set than even a good chief operating officer who keeps the day-to-day running. So that has to be tested. One, do they want to be owners? And two, do they have the skill to be owners? And that skill predominant.
Yeah, and that's a great point you brought up about a lot of times the owners underestimate their own contribution. And we were in a family meeting that we facilitated with another client who is one of the routes that they're considering transferring to kids in the business. And in a family meeting, the kids, the couple of kids that work in the business actually brought that point up.
Yeah.
They said, "Dad, we don't think you really fully realize what all you bring to the business." And they very humbly said, I don't know that I can do that. I don't know that I can or even want to. So that can even be, that of course can be true with key employees as well. Yeah. Okay. Anything else you guys can think of? So we mentioned assumptions about the key employees wanting to be owners. A lot of times the current owners assume that when really they don't want to, particularly these days, it seems. The ability, Corby just mentioned that too. Maybe they want to be, but they just really, at the end of the day, even if they've been key employees, it's a lot different. Corby just said this, being a key employee and being an owner. The other assumption one of you guys mentioned was, well, we had this situation years ago where Pete said, well, I'm just going to sell to a third party. And being as brilliant as we are, we asked some drill down questions about what he really wanted to do. And he said, well, what I'd really like to do is sell to my kids and the key employee who was helping me to build the business, but I know I can't. Well, again, being as skilled and talented as we are, we asked a few drill downs and found out that. And then 2 years later, we were able to help him put a plan in place to make that happen. So that assumption gets made and it needs to be tested too. Another thing that comes to mind is we want to uncover with this testing assumptions piece is, have they made promises already, right? Either verbally or written. A lot of times it's verbal, and a lot of times for the owner, it can almost be in passing or I don't know, maybe over a couple of beers or something. And the owner doesn't put as much stock into it, but the key employee listening to it's thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to be a future owner of this company. So uncovering that's pretty important too, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And
For
and one
sure.
last editorial on the employee wanting to be an owner. Many times employees want to be owners because if they have equity, hopefully it's going to bring them more compensation, et cetera. But in this case, the wanting to be an owner has to be that they have a drive to build the business and help the business succeed, that they have a fire in the belly for the business itself, not just the position or title. And it's a huge differential between those two postures of mind. The one that just wants to be an equity owner and not work any harder than they did, it's not going to succeed.
Yep, no, that's right. Okay, so then number two. So number one is basically identify and test assumptions that owners are making about a sale to insiders, and particularly
Hey,
about
Pat, can I go back to number one for a second?
Yeah.
Because I'd like to hear your take on this. We've been throwing out the term key employee, and you mentioned, maybe the owner offhand says something to somebody, about ownership. Haven't you seen situations where the business owner, his idea of a key employee is different than ours as exit professionals? So in other words, he's got his admin person who's been with him 40 years. In his mind, she or he's a key employee, but he or she really isn't. But that could be an example where he has said to her, he's made a promise or whatever. I mean, we've come across that situation, as I recall.
Yeah. So there is a process or at least one conversation, may take a couple, where helping the current owner, understand exactly what we mean by key employee, because you're right, their take on it can be different than our own. Ours would be, boy, if that person left Monday morning, revenue or operations or the business would seriously be seriously impacted and seriously suffer as a result of them leaving currently. Yeah. But then not only that, they're also a next level kind of employee, meaning that they haven't just been key in the past, but they're going to be key in the future. They've got they haven't reached full capacity in regard to their talent and skill and contribution to the business. Whereas a lot of times, yes, the owner may think, okay, the owner may think that John, who's been with her for 25 years as the controller, is key, even though, and he's important. There can be a difference between important and key too. But she might consider him key because he's been with her for so long and he has institutional knowledge and all like that. And that is important. But frankly, if she lost him Monday morning, it wouldn't be real difficult to replace John because his skill set hasn't grown. He's still doing the same things the way he's always done them. He's not going to take the business to the next level, so on and so forth. So that's a good point.
That was a really good explanation too. I really liked your the way you explained that. Thanks.
Oh, good. Thanks. Okay, good. Thanks for asking. All right. So number 2 actually kind of correlates with number 1. It's related to the first, which was testing assumptions. We need to consider the age of the key employees. And why is that important?
Well, as has been previously stated, successful buyout, the owner's taken a note. It's a rare time where, there's going to be a check written, or even if the buyers can get a bank loan, their ability to actually pay back the bank is still going to be dependent on the performance of the business. And we've run into this too, where the key employee is about the same age as the owner, well, that probably isn't a long runway.
Right.
When you get right down to it, and just the time it takes for the financial transaction to fully occur, it needs time.
It can be 10 years. I mean,
Yeah.
it can be 7, 10 years, sure.
And
yeah, no, that's right. So yeah, like if you're a key employee and you're approaching whatever you consider to be retirement age, do you want to take on the risk of buying
exactly
the business? Probably not. You're probably going to be more motivated by some cash incentive program like a stock appreciation rights or phantom stock. Yeah, I think these days too, the values are different. Different generations we've talked about this before, have different values, whereas a lot of the younger folks don't want the life that they see the business owner has.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want that. Okay, so that's number 2. Consider the ages. And does it make sense for a key employee and where they're at in their stage of life, their age, to become an owner?
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, again related, let's examine the owners and the key employees' risk tolerance. Probably don't need to ask why is this important. People listening probably understand it's important to understand the risk. But why is it important?
Well, I think, from the seller standpoint, the way I look at it is, we've had situations where the business owner has done a really good job of diversifying his wealth, and he's not the typical business owner who has, in excess of 85% of their wealth tied up in their business.
Mm-hmm.
If they are well diversified and they're in the position where they don't need to get every last dollar out of the sale of their business, that's going to mean that they can afford to take on a little more risk. So it's not as big of a deal for them. If for some reason they don't get every dollar, things are still going to be okay financially. On the buyer side, most of these deals, although it's interesting, we just did one recently where the buyer is personally guaranteeing the note. Usually in these cases, if something goes wrong, the seller's only recourse is to take the business back. But still, the buyer, we need to take a look at their risk tolerance, because being a business owner is a lot riskier than being an employee. I mean, I know, like when COVID first hit, our employees didn't take a pay cut, but every partner took a 50% pay cut for a while, So it's there's risk associated with being the business owner, because you have the burden of making sure the business runs.
Yeah, and another comment on that risk factor, from the buyer perspective. Yeah, I think oftentimes, as Walter said, at times owners can think, well, this is my easy way out, even though things are just kind of a mess, et cetera. Well, in reality, you know, prepping a business for a successful insider transfer is exactly the same as prepping it for a third-party sale. Because if the business has demonstrated the ability to plan, meet plans, project cash flow, meet goals, systems are in place, it's a well-run business, which that insider then, as they consider their own personal risk tolerance, they would have a far higher probability of buying into that, because risk is actually much lower. It's a reasonably well-oiled machine, and they're taking over something that they're not going to have to duct tape together to make it work. So again, I think it's just an errant, it gets back to the assumptions, an errant assumption that I don't actually have to have the thing running nice and smooth because I'm just going to sell to insiders. You know, that's a faulty assumption.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and just a little kind of sidebar note here that highlights things that you guys have said. If you early on in your business ownership career have the inclination that one day you're going to want to sell to insiders, two things to keep in mind, or maybe to have as part of your strategy. We've mentioned one: build the business as if you were going to sell it to a third party.
Yep.
Because it's going to be just as important. It's as strong for this kind of a transaction as it is for a third party, for all the reasons mentioned by Walter and Corby. And then the other piece to that is work with your wealth manager, financial advisor through the years to accumulate assets outside of the business. Because if you do have those assets outside of the business, you're going to have more flexibility. And you would be able to take on more risk with this transaction. If you really wanted the transaction to happen for values-based reasons, but boy, financially, I just not in a place to do it. If you work through the years with your financial advisor to invest outside of the business, it can afford you more flexibility when the time comes to do it. All right, so number 4 is, well, it's a concept that's kind of unnatural. It goes against human inclinations, if you will, and that is the concept of selling the business for the lowest, what we would call the lowest defensible value, because it can actually maximize the dollars received, because we're going to be looking to minimize the tax burden on the entire transaction, while at the same time minimize the risk of non-payment. So Walter, I'm going to put this on you. Briefly describe what we mean by using a strategy within this exit route strategy of the lowest defensible value.
Okay. So when a business is valued, realistically, different valuation professionals, would value it somewhat differently. So there is always a range of value. There's never the perfect number.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably, or possibly, when someone sells their business and retires, their income may go down because they're not going to be drawing salary from the company anymore. So what you may have is an opportunity to kind of arbitrage the tax rate of the buyer and the seller. So the theory is that the buyer is still going to be taking a salary and profits out of the business. So they're going to be in a fairly high tax bracket. The seller, because his only income may be this note and other investment income, is going to be in a low tax bracket. So like Pat said, your first inclination is, well, as the seller, well, I want to get the maximum sales price because that's all taxed as capital gain. So that's what I want.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is the buyer is in a kind of a disadvantage tax-wise because they're forced to basically buy what's called goodwill, and they only get to amortize that over 15 years. So it works out good for the seller, but not good for the buyer. So when you look at the tax rate, potential tax rate arbitrage, maybe there's a way where it's okay for the seller to pick up some ordinary income because he's in a low bracket, while the buyer will enjoy the benefits of getting an ordinary tax deduction right away at his higher bracket. So if you just think a simple example, if I'm in a 15% tax bracket and I get 1,000 and 15% ordinary tax bracket and I get $1,000, that costs me, I walk away with 850. Whereas the person who paid me, if they're in a 30% bracket, it only costs them 700 to do that. So there's an arbitrage there. And what we can do is we can kind of work the numbers so that the seller ends up net after tax with the same amount that he would have gotten on a 100% stock sale, value of the business 100%. But we can have it work out so that the buyer ends up paying less net after tax by repositioning some of the value into either a deferred comp or an ongoing salary or consulting agreement.
Mhm.
So it's a hard concept to explain in 2 minutes, but that's kind of the nutshell version.
No, that's well done. And listeners, just the big point here is that if you're considering this exit route, you need to consider this strategy of using the lowest defensible value combined with some direct payment options like deferred comp and consulting agreements and things like that.
Yeah.
Just know that. And then, so lastly today, guys, the fifth thing, and Corb, I'm going to put this one onto you because this is one of your fastballs, and that's modeling cash flow and why it's so important for this. I mean, it's just absolutely essential. It's not modeling, it's essential, but having strong cash flow, or what's sometimes referred to as discretionary free cash flow or discretionary cash flow, there's no bones about it. You got to have it. You got to have it. So what would you say about modeling cash flow? Is something that needs to be done before this route can even really seriously be considered?
I think you just crapshoot and wing it, No, if you remember back to the days of some math in high school and those multivariable algebra equations, an insider sale is one of the most complex multivariable mathematical problems you can find. Cash flow drives the ability to do the deal, but interest rates, tax rates, the deal structure, every variable changes up the in and out of it. And we have found that when we build a model that shows all the moving parts and enables an owner to say, well, what if we don't grow? What happens to both the buyer and the seller in their financial risk? And if we can model that out, the kind of the vague unknown becomes much more clear. Without that, there is almost a sense of taking a leap of faith, because there are so many moving parts. As Walter said, simple things like the amortization of goodwill and how that affects somebody. There are significant implications in one of the transactors' personal financial situation. And so to understand that clearly, and not just what it looks like at the time of transaction, but what it will look like over the next 5 to 10 years, the entirety of the deal structure really becomes critical. In a way, no different than projecting the cash flow of a business. Well, this is where the cash flow of the business really marries up with the personal cash flow of both buyer and seller, and understanding that can lead to, one, higher probability of success, but two, I think much greater satisfaction on both buyer and seller, that they're walking in eyes wide open, and that they're truly understanding their risks. The professionals involved are truly understanding their risks. And, when the day is done, they're all going to be happy at the end, or at least have the maximum probability of being happy.
Yeah, well said. And then, it all relates to, as well, back to what was it, the third issue that I mentioned today, examine the owners and the key employees' risk tolerance. Boy, when you do this, you and Walter together, and there's no better team, by the way, than Corby and Walter in doing this, because there's a cash flow piece and there's a tax implications piece. You guys are phenomenal doing this stuff. It's fantastic way to indeed examine the risk tolerance of both sides of the table, so to say, as the financial modeling takes place. The owner may be thinking, yeah, okay, I'm in a place where I can do that. But the buyers may be thinking, I don't know if I'm willing to take on the risk the way this is being modeled out. And it just flushes out, doesn't it? I mean, you guys
Does.
have seen.
Well, and another key element, Walter and I have dealt with this in the past few weeks, even just being able to understand the implications of that risk enables building in the mitigations in the deal document itself, so that there isn't some unintended constraint or consequence to either buyer or seller if in case there's a down year. Anticipating that up front and just kind of playing out the model to say, whoa, if that, then this.
Yeah.
Wow. How do we write that in? What's acceptable? And in a sense, rather than conflict resolution, it's conflict avoidance.
It's preventive, right?
And so important on an insider sale, because there is generally an implication of there's a relational history. There is that desire for one another's good. There is a partnership in a sense that you want to make sure you maintain. So when the day is done, you can still sit down and have that cocktail 5 years after the deal and enjoy it.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we're 40 minutes in, so we're going to wrap up. So Walter, I'm going to ask you just to summarize. In a second, I'm going to ask you to summarize what we talked about today. But before I do that, yeah, we're going to have another episode on this. What are the things I need to consider before I even go down the road of selling to insiders? We'll do one more episode on it, and we'll talk about things like equity structure or entity structure, checking and making sure you've got the right entity structure in place to make this happen, mostly from a tax efficient perspective. We'll explain the transfer of a significant amount of stock, explain the importance of covenants not to compete, and then we'll hit on dealing with the key employee group once the recommendation to go down this route is actually made. Mm-hmm. So we'll give you some tips on how to do that as well. So in the next episode. So Walter, what are some of the key takeaways you think from this episode here?
Yeah, there's definitely been a few. One is a sale to insiders is not the answer to your lack of preparing your business and generating transferable value within it. You need to test your assumptions regarding your key employees. Do they really want to be owners? Are they capable of being owners? And are they really key? Discuss that. Understanding risk on both the buyer and seller side. Understanding that there are possibly tax strategies. The one we mentioned is using what's called the lowest defensible value. And these strategies can help just the cash flow work better for both parties, which will make the odds of the deal being successful greater. And then the last thing we talked about was how important it is to model out the cash flow going forward, so everybody's comfortable and everybody has a realistic idea of what to expect as the deal plays out.
You were clearly listening. That was fantastic. Well done.
It's kind of like my wife in football. She says, why do you watch an entire game when you can just go to ESPN and watch the highlights?
Great point.
Yeah, so maybe listeners next time will just fast forward to the end of this and just get there.
It's good.
But listeners, we might not give a summary next time. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, listeners, if you want help in planning a sale to insiders and even considering these things and the other things we're going to talk about prior to even going down this road, get in touch with us. You can get in touch with us through exitreadiness.com or email at exitreadiness.com. And then use the code podcasts, all caps, if you set up a free exitreadiness.com account, and you'll receive a 10% discount on any products that you end up purchasing there. There's online virtual products there, very inexpensive, some are free, and can get you, continue to educate you and help you take some first steps in your planning. And then make sure to listen in next time as we continue this discussion on what you should consider prior to moving forward with an insider sale. And until next time, this is Pat Ennis and Walter Dial with Corby McGordon signing off.